Okay, everyone. Looks like we've got the last few stragglers there are grabbing their seats and sitting down to listen in. So I think we'll make a start for those of you that are already logged in. So morning and welcome to this Farscape Development webinar on the topic of unconscious bias. I hope you've been enjoying our little hold screen there. I think we'll let your own unconscious biases decide what that picture's all about. But thanks anyway to Will's daughter, Lily, who drew it for us. So my name's Neil Kimberley, and I'm the commercial director here at Farscape Development. And my role today is purely to act as the host and to welcome you into the webinar, and also to curate any of the questions that we hope you'll send through to us using the chat function at the bottom of the screen as we go through. So just to get the ball rolling, let's just give you the agenda so you can see what's coming. So the things that we're going to talk about over the next 50 minutes to an hour or so is trying to define what this actually is, try and get some clarity there. It's a broad and complex subject, so hopefully we'll try and get some more clarity around that. And I know that's something Will's going to be talking about. We're also going to look at the valency of it. Is it good? Is it bad? Are we indifferent to it in organisations? And what impact does that have, depending on how we view it? And also then, so why should it be relevant at all in an organisation? I'm sure you've all got plenty of other agendas and programs that you've got running. So why on earth would we add another one to the list, and where would it come in that list of priorities? So hopefully that'll be something we'll give you some more information and ideas on by the end of the presentation. And also, how does it actually develop? How can people engage with it, and can those behaviours and cultures change within organisations around bias? And then also then how do we actually engage with it at a practical level? I know it's been around for a long time as a topic. I'm sure people have read into it and then understood it at an intellectual level, but how in an organisation with groups, teams, individuals, do you actually engage with it at a practical level? So in terms of a bit of housekeeping for the webinar, you'll see that we've got the moderated chat function on the bottom of the screen. So please do engage with us. If there are any questions that crop up as Will's presenting, then I'll be moderating those. If they're appropriate at the point that he's at in the presentation, I'll try and not interrupt his flow too much and see if I can drop some of those in. If not, then we're going to try and finish with about 15 minutes to spare at the end, so that we can try and see if there are any themes coming out of the questions and pose those at the end so that we can talk through them. To try and keep it a bit more interactive as well, we've got a couple of polls that we'll post at various points, and will signpost you to those. So please do engage with the polls when they come up. To be honest, it's a good test for us of those of you out there that have actually still stayed engaged and still listening, and which of you have just got it running in the background on your desktop and are now doing something else. So hopefully we'll get a good 100% interaction with the polls. And then finally, I know Will's also got a little activity for you to do as well. So that'll involve you needing a pen and a paper at some point. So if you can get those to hand, that'll be useful for you to take part. Okay, so I mean, that's all the housekeeping done. So I'll start by saying that the majority of the discussion today will be in the capable hands of one of our senior associates, Will Carlson. And Will's got a huge breadth of experience in this topic, and not just from an academic perspective, but also through his particular interest, his expertise, and specialism, in helping organisations genuinely unpack the subject of unconscious bias and then really get hands-on with it in a productive and generative way. It's clear that we've had a lot of interest in this particular webinar and its subject, and it's been great to see so many of you joining us from around the country this morning. It's clearly a topic that's been gaining momentum and popularity, and people's interest in it has risen over the last couple of years across our industry. And I know we've specifically noticed that within our own clients. And I guess our aim today is to try to pull together some of that experience, our own sort of research and reading, and try and pull it together, try to pull together this, this broad subject that it is in a way that, is going to help you within your organization identify, how it can be practically explored. It's interesting. We plan these topics for our webinars, many months in advance so that we can, advertise them to you. And at the time of coming up with this topic, to be honest, I don't think we had any idea when we planned it, having this, this webinar on unconscious bias, how timely it would be given some of the decision making that's been taking place recently in our society here in the UK, which has obviously led to this current uncertain political, social and economic times that we now find ourselves in. So in preparing for this webinar today, it did lead me to reflect earlier on this morning about, what unconscious biases must have been at play on both sides of the recent referendum vote, for example. And similarly, currently, in the leadership elections and battles of both the Labour and Tory parties, what biases are happening within the parties and within the media around, how that's all viewed. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out over the coming months, and I'm sure some of the things that Will's going to be talking about are going to feel quite relevant for what's going on around us at the moment. I was also wondering about what impacts unconscious bias has during these uncertain economic times for both individuals, and organisations. What is valued and what's sacrificed when people are making changes in these times? What is viewed as essential versus what other people might see as a luxury, and how are people going about making those decisions? How much is conscious and how much is driven by potentially unconscious biases? And it's an interesting thought that came to mind this morning that I've been pondering over, and I'm sure there's some of you out there sitting there this morning that know that some of those economic decisions are going on in your organisation, as we speak during this webinar. So something to reflect on maybe as we go through and how it's currently playing out in your organisation. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the webinar now, and I'll hand you over to the capable hands of Will Carlson. So Will, over to you.
Neil, thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be with you at 11 o'clock-ish today. And as Neil said, we've got an hour or so to talk through this subject. And I'm going to approach it from a number of different angles to try and give you some insights around what we currently do, what bias may well be about, and how you might engage with it in your organisation to create positive effect. My background is many and varied. So I've worked in the field of behavioural change for the last 17 years. And I coach and I facilitate and I consult with organisations around what that actually means, what they do, and practically how they might engage in the subjects of behavioural change, including unconscious bias. My background also includes one of being an actor maybe 25, 30 years ago, and there's quite a clear correlation between behavioural change in organisations and the skill of learning how to act and be creative. Art in itself is about bias. Art is interpretation. It's a preference. And indeed, any good drama that you watch nowadays is all about bias. It's all about unconscious bias. One person says one thing, and yet we think they mean something else. And that's what makes it quite dynamic and interesting. If you can make those conscious decisions come about in your daily work, at work, between people who are engaged in doing business, then they can become quite articulate and choice-making. And that makes for highly efficient individuals, highly efficient teams. And it takes a lot of the mystery out of why do people do the things that they do. So Neil was talking about the relevance of the times that we're in at the moment in terms of the bias. I thought it was fascinating yesterday when Michael Gove said as his parting speech from the Conservative leadership campaign, his parting comment was, "One thing we do know is that one of them, our Prime Minister, will be a woman because we've got 2 women." I can't remember the last time watching a political debate when it finished with the comment of "one thing we do know is the Prime Minister will be a man." So is bias relevant? Is it present? Yes, everywhere from the top to the bottom. So let's get into the subject of what bias is all about. For me, trying to engage in the subject matter of bias in an organisation and trying to make that something that is an active part of learning and development for an organisation is almost the same as asking people to get naked. It makes people feel uncomfortable, exposed, and You know, when you've got people pointing out your flaws and differences and weaknesses and, you know, whatever it is they might have as an opinion about you, it's deeply uncomfortable. And if it's a blunt instrument that you're using in order to explore what a bias is, don't be surprised when people have some fairly blunt reactions to it. So in terms of what is bias, for me, it's a way of navigating through life to achieve familiar, safe, comfortable, and predictable experiences. They are filters that we use, and it's the way that we filter things into our world, and it's the way that we filter things out so that people can make sense of it in the way that we hope that they will. It's also a way of considering preferences, and a preference for something positive or a preference for something negative. It's our shortcuts that get us from A to B. You know, it's the reason why most of us have jobs. It's because we can get out of bed, dress ourselves, brush our teeth, get on some form of transport, get to work and do some stuff without having to think it through from start to finish and relearn it. So bias can be really, really useful. I think the bias that most organizations are focused on is trying to get rid of the negative bias, but it's intrinsically linked with bias per se. Everybody has bias everywhere in their life. It's just that sometimes it clashes with cultural values, with, you know, organization values, and it clashes with other individuals that you're working with. So how do we engage with unconscious bias in a developmental way that includes all types of different bias? How we live our biases then is a significant part of that discussion, because if it's part of who you are as a person, one thing you don't want to do is dissect people down to component parts with a view of putting them back together. What you want to do is help people become more insightful about maybe why they do the things that they do. So how do we live it? Well, it comes out through identity, and identity may come in any number of different forms: what you know, how you dress, who you're with, your social network, behavior. The choices that you make every single step of the way, everything you do, will somehow be fueled by some of the biases and the preferences that you have on a daily basis. And that's great because it gives us a clear identity, and sometimes that's the thing that is the greatest value that we bring to an organization. We like this person because of what they represent, because of what they do, the choices that they've made, the preferences that they've got. If what you have is an organization that also has negative biases, then engaging in the what are those and how do we talk about them and what else could we do is a great way of starting to think about developing individuals and teams and a broader business perspective. We are very different. We don't have to be the same. And as you can see from this slide here, you know, the things that make us feel comfortable, the things that define us, the things that make us different are many and varied. And so they should be. If you're looking at an organization with a view to developing a greater sense of inclusion, what do people need to know about other people? Is it what they look like, or is it the reason why they look like that? Is it what they actually do, or the reason why they do the things that they do? So many different questions. In terms of how you might categorize bias, you could start off by looking at it and saying, well, it can be either positive or negative. And I would suggest that understanding bias from a negative perspective or a positive perspective from both the conscious and unconscious aspects is absolutely critical. So unconscious bias that is negative can often be rationalized as humor or style, ambition, opinion, or authority, and a number of other different types of descriptors, but they're not necessarily pejorative statements around other people and how they are and why they do what they do, but they are around giving a rationale behind a particular bias that's come out. So if somebody makes a comment in work that potentially makes somebody feel uncomfortable related to what they look like, or, you know, the groups that they subscribe to, or an attitude that they have, or whatever it is they do, but it's slightly on the cusp of being inappropriate, maybe a little bit offensive, if they don't even realize they're doing it, somebody might say, well, that's just their sense of humor, it's just their style, it's just the way that they are. And that may not work for some people, and it may work for some other people, but what do you do with that? Well, it's a starting point to start investigating. Well, why did you do that? How do you think it made somebody else feel? So it's a starting point for a conversation that can be generative, because if people don't even realize their unconscious biases are having a negative impact on people, how you bring that into the discussion is as critical as what the discussion is all about. Conscious bias that is negative is often called prejudice. If I know that you're offending me, then I can say that that is prejudicial treatment of me. And that could be potentially positive, but often it's negative. And, you know, people like to demonstrate sometimes they have a negative bias against other people, and they like to have prejudices, and they like for that to be seen. At work, we then tend not to demonstrate huge prejudicial opinions and views and relationships because it's often degenerative for other people. If you look at positive bias, unconscious positive bias can often be experienced as a high level of care or interest, help or support. So people don't even necessarily know that they are unconsciously biased in a positive way, but it's their general raison d'etre in life to want to be a caring person, to have a level of interest, to be helpful or supportive. Conscious bias that is positive, i.e. I am making choices now about what I do, how I do it, and I know this is in positive service of me, somebody else, the team that I'm working with, the organization, the stakeholders, etc., can often be experienced as high-functioning, choice-making, and self-actualizing. And that is a really great place to be. So we can have positive biases that are really in service of everybody. So the challenge here, the challenge is what we might call the arc of distortion. And the arc of distortion is this. My communication is my communication. And with that, I have an intention. This is what I think I'm communicating to you. The challenge is that their perception, your perception of me, what you're really receiving, may be subtly or significantly different. And that is the real challenge. This distortion that happens in the middle, what you notice isn't in that list is message. So messages are messages are messages. The what you talk about is content. Email's a great format for delivering messages, but how it gets distorted is through thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and relationships. And this is where we tend to do most of our work, is helping people to understand what's the thinking process that people have, what are the feelings attached to that, what behavior manifests, and how are relationships formed, you know, for good or for bad, within any form of communication. And if what you can do is narrow that gap of distortion so that you can be clear that your intention is what somebody else is perceiving, then that's a very, very productive place to be. What tends to happen in terms of unconscious bias that is negative, i.e. people don't realize that they are negatively impacting on other people, is they don't even understand the clarity around the distortion when somebody says, but my perception is that you're being like this. And they say, really? That's not what I intended. I've got no idea. How could you possibly be interpreting it in that way? So you're starting from two completely different perspectives, two completely different places of meaning for the different parties. And understanding what those places are is absolutely critical in order that you can define the way forward. How do we need to work with these people? What is it they need from us in terms of support? How do we bring them together? What do we discuss? What are the solutions? And of course, different people will have a different perception in terms of my communication, and it can be wildly different. So this is one of my favorite slides. It indicates what I think is real difference in terms of perception. So another way of considering bias is to think about whether or not bias is good or bad for business. Now, I would suggest that bias is and can be bad for business. It can be degenerative for people or processes or for an organization as a whole. And when you start thinking about when is it bad for business, if you've got a situation where it degrades or undermines people, processes, or relationships, the bias within that, the often unspoken bias, is going to impact on people. Bias is bad for business when it prevents change. People feel undermined, undersupported, or undervalued. And quite simply, for all of you, or any of you who know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when it reduces people further down Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's when you can really start thinking about how much of an impact is this having on the functioning of the individuals and teams. Where we want people to be at some point, maybe on a daily basis, maybe as an organization as a whole, is self-actualizing, so that they can find a degree of self-fulfillment. And that means being able to be aware of what you're doing, aware of what other people are doing, and working with them consciously in the moment. It's a place where people can be objective about their subjective experience. It's where you would have adult relationships. If you start coming down that pyramid and start thinking about, well, if actually people are questioning about their self-esteem, then that's not such a high-functioning place to be in an organization. And as we come down that, if you have people who are questioning about the intimacy of the relationships and the friends that they have, And that work, what is the quality of those relationships? If they're not good, if they are degenerative, then that's going to impact on all of the stuff above it, obviously, but it's also going to make you much more basic in terms of the functions that you have with other people. Safety needs. If you've got people concerned about their safety with other people, then that's a fairly basic place to be at work. And the physiological needs, a lot of the time, I think we would not even question whether the physiological needs are being attended to at work, because, you know, we're a first world country, we're democratic, we're, you know, doing all the right things, it's all in place, we've got minimum wage, etc., etc. Surely those things are not in question. Well, if any of you have managed to keep up with a certain online sports retailer that's been in the news quite a lot recently, I would suggest that actually the physiological needs absolutely are in question. When you have people who are being held in pens before they can leave work and searched, I would suggest that probably the physiological needs are absolutely something that are, you know, not being respected. So I think organizations can fit in all of these different areas, and if bias and preference and choice making is reducing the level at which your people can operate, then that's a really useful consideration in terms of, so where do we need to start and what do we need to feed into this? In terms of bias being good for business, what does it do? If you can engage with it, if you can understand it, if you can work with it, it helps teams to become more than the sum of their parts. So it moves beyond simply function, simply knowledge, simply application of tools, and it creates what you might consider to be a more collaborative environment, because people want to be with each other because it's in service of each other, and potentially a more interdependent organization. One of the challenges that we see a lot of the time is when people ask us about exploring the idea of unconscious bias. Oh, and by the way, it sits over there in that team, or it's in this particular silo. Please go fix, and then we'll be fixed as an organization. And actually, that's almost never true. It's part of a system, it's part of a process, and it's part of an environment that actually fosters it and allows it to survive. So if you can look at bias both in terms of exploring the negative bias and the positive bias, and think, how do you become more than the sum of your parts? That then adds value over and above simply fixing a problem. Bias is good when it embraces change, difference, and inclusion. Inclusion is hugely important for most organizations at the moment, and you know, the subject of diversity and inclusion is intrinsically linked with bias. Organizations are filled and fueled with people who fit particular demographics because there are biases existing in the business, and you can't usually stamp them out, but what you can do is become more aware of them and create a culture that is more inclusive by nature. When it fosters innovation, when risk is considered healthy, when innovation is applied to thinking, emotions, and behavior, as well as technical competence, all of these things are about fueling bias for positive, for good. I had the pleasure of speaking with the head of research and development for 3M last year, and they take the notion of bias to another level altogether. They are the people who started the thing that Google now does, which is giving people 20% of their time in the organization to do with what they will. Well, 3M gives their research and development engineers 15% of their working week. There's 12,000 people globally, 15% of their working week to do with what they will. And what they're actually asking people to do is use their bias. They don't want them to do the same thing that everybody else does all the time. They want them to go away and think differently, be differently, engage differently, challenge the status quo, add a little bit of grit and agitation to what they do, how they do it, in order that they can create something that isn't the norm, that they can put things together in a different way. And that's absolutely using people's preferences, biases, choices to fuel change and innovation. And for an organization like 3M that has a product portfolio of 55,000 products and releases 5 new products on the market every day of the year, the one thing they do need is people with different ideas, with different ways of thinking, and that comes right down to bias. So it can be a hugely generative part of what an organization is and how it works. If we look at what might be positive outcomes for a business, I think it's worth also considering that positive outcomes also come for people as well as businesses. I think these two lists show that there are potential qualitative and some quantitative outcomes that you could be looking to achieve. And I know I've engineered this definitely with a business view to the qualitative nature being a definite benefit. But in terms of measuring success that we'll look at on the next slide, that's when we would, I suggest, measure the outcome in terms of goals or targets, if you like. From a personal perspective, and I think that bias is a hugely personal subject, If you can see the positive side being based on confidence, difference, emotional relationship intelligence, resilience, authenticity, and uniqueness, that gives people an identity and the need to be unique and individual. That gives them a great platform to work from, rather than you need to be all the same. And I think if people recognize that there is huge value in them as an individual, that will undoubtedly feed into their input into the organization. In terms of measuring success, so as I said just now, in terms of goals and achievement, absolutely business will look at that. And trying to find the balance between how do we simply work as an organization to achieve particular goals. Any of you from large organizations will undoubtedly have, FTSE shareholders, etc., looking to measure that success in percentage points and revenue. But goals may also be recognized as, are we an efficient system? Are we forward thinking? Are we progressive? Are we inclusive? So what are your goals? And if you start thinking about harmony, growth, inclusion, feedback, etc., those features and factors can be wildly different for different organizations. And where do you need and want to be? What is the reputation that you have at the moment? What are you trying to develop your reputation to be? From a personal perspective, how do I measure bias? How do I measure the success of it in the organization I'm in? Well, it's my lived experience. Does it stack up to be meaningful for my beliefs and values? Is it congruent with my preferences? Is my performance getting better? Do I have quality relationships? And do I have a sense of belonging? There's been studies done in the States, if any of you have had the chance to read them, about why people leave organizations. Quite a lot of work done on why people leave from ethnic minorities in organizations, or ethnic minorities leave. And the resounding results have been people don't leave jobs, they leave their bosses. And so that sense of belonging comes right down to the intrinsic nature of the relationship that individuals have with their bosses. And if that isn't meaningful, if that isn't something that stacks up to be something that gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you to work, then people are not in a well-supported place. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at a poll. And what I want you to do is to think about, oh no, we're not going to look at a poll. We're going to look at one last thing. I mentioned on this slide, a couple of slides before here, in terms of how do we measure success, the law. So in terms of the law, just to give a backstop to this, if you like, protected characteristics are things that you may be familiar with. And this is part of the Equalities Act. And what this, the reason I put this in here is because this is the benchmark of what you can't discriminate against. And most organizations subscribed to this, either hugely specifically or generally or somewhere in between. And it's not often that you would get an organization that clearly flouts that. Said sports company, internet retailer, was flagged up as not obviously subscribing to this when they were talking about, people giving birth to children, or women giving birth to children in toilets at one of their facilities. So, people don't always get this right. But if you've got people discriminating against other people or showing biases against other people in any of these protected characteristics, it's quite an easy thing to identify. What becomes a little bit more challenging is when people's characteristics aren't listed here. So if you, for instance, felt that somebody was biased negatively against you and it was to do with your sense of humor or things that you liked or your attitude or the manner in which you talked, the tone of voice, your body language, if those are some of the things that are now being potentially discriminated against, or people are using in a negative way against you, how do you bring those into the discussions? If attitude, if your liking for technical things, or your liking for creativity and art, or if your divergent thinking, your convergent thinking are things that people tend to use against you, how do you start engaging in a conversation that helps you be included? One of the other things in terms of the law that I think is really important is to understand what harassment and bullying are all about, because bias negatively can very much feel like a form of harassment or bullying. Now, bullying, interestingly, isn't illegal. Harassment is illegal. So if you're harassed or you feel somebody else is being harassed and you feel it on their part, you can do something about it in the eyes of the law. I think what is important here is to recognize the qualitative nature of what bullying and harassment are. If someone feels intimidated or offended and behavior that is unwelcome or unwarranted causes a detrimental effect, intimidating or hostile, degrading, those type of words, if they're relating to the protected characteristics, that's easier to define. If they're relating to other elements of how your business operates, then you're in a whole different type of discussion that moves out of, subscribing to the law and into how do we need to come together and recognize what we're doing as a business that's enabling these type of conversations or this type of bias to manifest? I was working with a recruitment company a while ago, and one of their challenges that they recognized quite clearly was that their sales floor was quite aggressive in terms of how they operate. What that meant was anybody coming into that organization had to subscribe to the biases that the sales floor used as their daily type of behavior. And some people found it particularly uncomfortable, and it made it very challenging for certain demographics or people with certain attitudes or certain styles to operate in that environment, because everybody's bias, the group and team bias, so clearly defined the expectations of newcomers that effectively you either subscribed to it or you got eaten up and then you left. And it was very challenging for that team to develop. So what I want you to do now to the poll, which is now coming up, is I want you to think about this question, and what you're going to get is a series of options to answer, and you can answer as many as you like. So just I want you to focus on, how do you see bias manifest in your organization? Click as many as you think are relevant to you, and then afterwards we'll have a look at what we think the sweep is in terms of types of biases you are experiencing. Just to make it clear, this is totally anonymous, so nobody's referenced in any way either on this poll or afterwards, so feel free to put on what you want. And we'll look at all of those when you fill them in, and I'll give you a minute to fill them in. So here's the survey. Okay, so there we've got 67% people. So Neil, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting because someone had posted a question just before this came up, actually, which I think sort of captures some of the sort of the spread of things on there as well. And it's interesting, but along the lines of where you were talking about the protected characteristics before, and how some organisation use cultural fit as an excuse not to hire talent, but actually are using it as a bias against those protected characteristics.
Yes.
Do you see that sort of, I suppose whether that's, you know, the in and out groups?
Yeah, we're going to come to that at the moment.
Favoritism, either positive or negative favoritism, I guess.
Yeah, I've got an example of that in the biases that we're going to talk about in just a moment. And we've got 48% of people on here saying fixed mindset, and I think that potentially ties in with a fixed mindset, which is we know what we know, we like what we like, and we want to stick with what we know. And it can, you know, and then we've got 61% on favoritism. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's a couple of potentially positive things in here in terms of heightened positive emotion. Doesn't get a particularly high rating on here.
No, it's interesting.
In groups and out groups, I mean, they can be both positive or negative. It depends how they fit within the organization. Okay, so that's great. That's given us a little bit of insight there. I suppose there is something to be read into the fact that heightened negative emotion is seen much more readily, you know, 3 times more than heightened positive emotion, and that would fit quite regularly with most organizations. You know, when we work with people on feedback skills relating to performance management systems and tools, it's often that people are very comfortable, not comfortable, but they do lots of negative feedback, which can be quite emotive, but less often do people do positive feedback and potentially the positive emotions that come with it. So let's come back to the deck and move on. We've got a bit of stuff to go here, so I'm going to push on through and just cover some ground in terms of types of biases. If you're interested to find out types of biases, there isn't a list, or there is a list on Wikipedia, but you can make them up. I mean, biases is just a way of giving a short sentence to describe something. But these are some of the ones that we see in business quite a lot. So confirmation bias. Simply, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the way people look for things to confirm your own preconceptions. You might have that as an individual looking for a way of confirming what you want to be true. You might have that as an organization trying to confirm what you want to use to define your business performance. I just remember seeing last week that M&S's clothes have gone down by 8.9%. You know, do they look at that internally and say, okay, what are we doing? Is it our design? Is it the way that we operate our shops? Is it our people, how we communicate? Or is it the market conditions have changed? Is it that the competition is too broad? Or, you know, are they looking internally or are they looking externally? And what are they looking to confirm what they know to be true? For a person to confirm what they know to be true sometimes might be more discomforting than they're prepared to engage with. And so some of the work that we do with organizations is looking around what are people trying to find in terms of evidence, and actually what is it that is presenting itself to people that may be uncomfortable, but may be the real insight they need. So confirmation bias is one. Another type of bias that you can consider is affinity bias. So that's treating people like us in a favorable manner. And one of the reasons why we like affinity bias is because it creates really nice in-groups. We get to work with and be with people who are like us, and it makes us feel good. And then you might find that you're working in an organization that's fueled and populated by people who think like you do, feel like you do what you do. That can be good to some degree, but it can also be exclusive to anybody who's not like you. And if it doesn't represent the people that you work with, then that in itself might be a real challenge. Are your stakeholders looking for organizations just like them, or are they looking for a more broader, more diverse type of organization to work with? You might consider in-group bias and out-group bias as a potential bias that's in your organization. So are you being inclusive or exclusive? Benevolence bias is something that comes up quite a lot, and that's potentially treating people in a particular way according to your own biases. But if I convince myself I'm doing it for good, then potentially I can excuse any poor decisions I make on your behalf. This comes up sometimes when people are talking about gender bias and people making decisions on behalf of either men or women because they know that they like to travel, they like challenge, they like home life, they're more in need at home than they are at work. So rather than asking you what it is you want or what you need, I'll just make a decision on your behalf, and if I think it's in your service, I don't even need to have a discussion with you. I can simply make that decision. Expectation anchoring is something that Neil was referring to just now, and expectation anchoring is where you as an individual have an expectation, either good or bad, and that then impacts on their performance. So if I expect you to perform well in any given situation at work, excuse me, and my bias is that you will perform well, not only am I biasing my particular preference, but I'm also going to bias your performance. So if I think you're going to do well, the chances are you will do better than somebody who I think is going to do badly, because my expectation now is impacting on how you engage with our relationship. Moving on to why some of these things actually matter and why they are inherent in who we are. I think it's fundamentally born out of emotions. So emotions are often driving us, and you know, they're driving the bus, if you like. And where they are born out of is the fight, flight, freeze instinct. And that fight, flight, freeze is something that is quite familiar in most businesses now. The bit that I think makes it really useful in business is considering whether it is a form of social threat or survival threat. And the reason that that's important is because survival threat is when we think we're in fear for our life. So we tend to do fight or flight, and occasionally do freeze. If we're that scared, we just literally can't move. The reason survival threat is important and social threat is important is because they elicit almost exactly the same response in the brain. The adrenaline, neocortisol flood the brain under pressure, under threat. In a social situation, that might be something like presenting at work, having a challenging conversation with somebody at work, having a conversation with somebody about their biases at work. And when those things come about, it can incapacitate people. And if you're not familiar with what that feels like, then the chances are when it comes your way, you're going to do one of three things: fight, flight, or freeze. In work, that makes you something of a liability now, because what we've learned over the millennia is that in a work context, literally running away or punching somebody tends to not get a particular good reaction. So what we tend to do is freeze, but we don't freeze still. We freeze in a repetitive pattern of behavior. And it's that repetitive pattern of behavior that makes change and progression in an organization really, really difficult. Because under pressure in a social situation, somebody said something, we experience a bias coming about, somebody thinks there's a sense of humor, I feel really uncomfortable. The chances are I'm going to do the same behavior I've always done before in order that I can predict the outcome. So if you're being biased and I'm uncomfortable with it, the chances are I won't challenge you, because I just want to get through it. I just want to get to the end of it. And if you're the one who's being biased, the chances are you're going to continue that biased behavior because it predicts that actually I did it before and it was okay, so I'll just carry on doing it. So in a social situation, threat is ever present. The good thing is that we can learn our way around it. And both survival and social threat, we can learn that things can be moved from the part of the brain that triggers that, and that's called the amygdala. So the amygdala says fight, flight, or freeze, and we can retrain it. So in terms of three bits of the brain that are important to consider, the limbic system pretty much pushes our emotions and tells us emotionally how we're reacting to something. And in part of the limbic system is the amygdala. And the bit that it comes in conflict with is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the bit that is our rational brain. And our rational brain is the bit that we use as a higher functioning part of our brain. It is the bit that says, I can think opposing thoughts and still function. So basically what that means is that you can think things that are not in your favor and still do them, which means you can have a challenging conversation. You can engage with difficult situations and think, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't like doing it. I don't know if I've got all the skills, but do you know what? I can do this. And I'm going to engage with those people in order to be able to generate a discussion that's going to be useful, develop the skills that's going to be useful for both of us. So you could think about what's driving you. If what's driving you is your emotions, then how do you allow your rational brain to engage with your emotions and say, do you know what, I need to be thinking now. I need to be able to make smart, engaged, rational decisions, and therefore not just being reactive with my emotional brain. If any of you have been to the zoo, then I know that you've already mastered the art of retraining your amygdala, because if you stood in front of a lion enclosure, you understand the concept of glass, which means when it comes up and wants to eat you, you don't run away. So you've already trained your amygdala to know that in this situation, this is no longer threat. So you can replace threat very quickly and very efficiently. If I can get this video to work, this is a great example of what happens to people in a social situation when they're presented with a degree of threat. There we go. Okay. Bit of shameless advertising for Carlsberg there. I like that. I mean, it shows some real reactions to people, and it shows how discomforted people are. At the same time, you've got a bit of retraining of the brain at the end, which is, this isn't threat after all, and therefore I can engage and be part of that group. So it's a pretty quick and easy way of thinking about what does it take for you to be in a situation where you're discomforted, and then move forward and find out what information you need to know about this group in order to redefine the parameters. So the discussion that is often part of a lead into any work that I do with organizations around bias is it nature or nurture? And I think you could simply define nature and nurture in terms of behavior and personality. Personality is nature. It's how you feel, it's how you react, it's what you're born with. Behavior is nurture and therefore learned. And the point about behavior is it serves a purpose. It's always purposeful, even if you look at somebody else and you think, why would you do that? Well, that's a great question. And if you don't know the answer, if you did know the answer, that would be fantastic. If you keep in mind that behavior serves a purpose, both yours and other people's, investigating what that purpose is the very thing that's going to help you discover, uncover, and work with biases. So when you ask yourself the question, why in the world would somebody do that? If you could understand their motivation as to why they did that and what they were trying to achieve in terms of an outcome, and it's quite possibly going to be comfort, safety, familiarity, control, predictability, etc., then you are informed and in a position where you can have a generative conversation. When people do stupid stuff and you think that plainly is not appropriate for them, for the other person, or the organization, it's not fueled by making smart decisions, thinking, do you know what, I thought today would be a great day to do something stupid to end my career. The chances are it's going to be something attached to a personal preference, a personal bias, a value, or a belief. And if you don't know what that is, starting to have a conversation around that is a critical part of moving forward in terms of investigating bias. The thing that is critical in terms of what to do next, and we're going to start thinking about, okay, so what do you do? Now you may have some more information about bias. It needs to include people from both perspectives. Bias is not about identifying people who are at fault and then either blaming them, judging them, and fixing them. It's about including both parties, so people who are biased in one way or another and people who feel that bias in a negative way. They are an integral part of a relationship that is born out of acceptance, of people allowing bias to exist and people exhibiting bias. So engagement is the critical word here, rather than identifying and fixing. The moment you start to engage with it, you can start to change the dynamics and you can start to change the criteria on which people are expected to have conversations and develop and learn. How you engage with that challenge is going to be critical. So if you have an appetite, and you can demonstrate that appetite from an L&D perspective or an HR perspective or a leadership perspective, that's going to send a really clear, strong message to people about what's important in your organization. A desire to want to engage with challenging topics, a clear message of intent and support that is relevant to individuals and teams is going to be absolutely critical in order that people can understand what's happening, why is it happening, and how does it impact on me. The conditions and the environment that you set are equally important. Without supportive conditions and without a supportive environment, it's almost impossible to create any meaningful and sustainable change. So if you can put those things in place that say to people, okay, here's a subject, but hey, these are the conditions that I'm going to offer up. This is the environment that we are going to foster to work with this. Those things are interrelated as an ongoing part of the development. Conditions and environment let people know that they're safe and supported, and it's the platform from which you can build a really strong generative development and learning opportunity for people with regards to team dynamics, personal development, skills, etc. So that moving from unconscious to conscious is what I would call the move from reactive to active, the move from illogical to choice making, the move from instinctive to learning through choice, the move from being safe to change, from comfortable to challenge. And I'm sure there's many other journeys that you could take, but those are just 5 that I've put together that seem to be regular features of how people engage with the move from unconscious to conscious development. In terms of critical success inputs, what do you have to put into the organization to learning and development in order for this to be something that is seen to be a significant part of how your organization is going to move forward? So in terms of practical things that you might do, contracting for development. So contracting can be from the board downwards. It can be from graduates, new starters, upwards. If you don't get contracting between people and create a voice for all the parties involved, then it doesn't become a contract, it becomes a mandate. And that's very difficult, because if you're mandated to, remove any bias from your business, the chances are that's not going to resonate with people. And contracting for development needs to be both qualitative and quantitative. Engaging with the challenge, top to bottom, bottom to top. So engagement demonstrates that there is a level of interest and a level of investment coming from the organization, and therefore expected from the individuals. A clear narrative for individuals and teams and the organization. So rather than this be a fix and a remedial intervention, what's the narrative going forward? What's the vision? What's the big picture? What's the expectation? What do you want? What can you give? I've just talked about generative conditions and practical inputs, and a climate that engages with emotional inputs. What's the safety net that you need to input in your organization? So when this does get difficult, which it will, when it is uncomfortable, which it will be, when people don't know whether or not they should take the next step because they can't see the way forward, what's the safety net you've put in there that says it's okay to explore this, to take a risk, to ask this question, to make this observation? In terms of the last couple of critical success inputs, what do you need to do to enable people to choose to be autonomous for their own good, for their own development? And what level of competence do your people currently have? Because of the level of competence in terms of thinking, feeling, doing, in terms of emotional resilience, in terms of the skills they've got, if that level of competence is not where it needs to be, how do you start engaging with development that touches on competence at any number of different levels? In terms of critical success outcomes, these are the things that we tend to work with organizations when they say, so what do you want to be at the end of all of this? So this is a quick list of things that we tend to work with: honesty, integrity, respect, trust, and courage, innovation, resilience, inclusion, emotional intelligence, and relationship intelligence. Now, whilst they are lots of qualitative aspects of how people come together in organizations, I think they are intrinsically linked to the quantitative elements of how an organization works. Without these, without this level of systemic health, if you like, it's easy to see why some organizations struggle. And if you are simply focused on what you do rather than how you do it, then you are a functional organization, but you're probably not an organization that as a system works at a particularly high level. In terms of what you can do, in terms of going forward, articulate the need upwards and downwards. So if you haven't got a clear rationale as to what the challenge is, what you need to do, what you could do, then how are you articulating that? Are you identifying problems? Are you coming to it from a rational perspective, or are you coming at it from an emotional perspective or a performance perspective? So articulating that need, make it personal. So if it's not personal, it needs to be. Bias is hugely personal. If it comes down to an arbitrary observation or judgment, then anybody can excuse themselves for it. So the moment it's personal is the moment it becomes more accountable, and people need to be responsible. So, which was my next point. Accountability and responsibility are critical. We are all responsible for our own behavior and how we engage with other people. If we get it wrong, we need an environment and people equipped with the ability to highlight that and make it generative and inclusive with other people moving forward. What else can you do? Give people the right tools for the job. Embrace failure as well as success. Stimulate people and processes. I say stimulate, I'd probably even say agitate. Get in there and offer a bit of grit, a bit of resilience. What are the questions that are not being asked? What are the things that are not being done? Are you simply a comfort-seeking organization or a silo, or are you there looking to explore what are the boundaries? Are you there to agitate things, not to simply break, but to work out how to reform them, how to come together in a different way? Provide possibility and purpose. Purpose is critical. It's the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we engaged in this type of development? Why are we here as an organization? Why should I do this? And if you can provide possibility with that things can change, that I can be better skilled, that I can be in charge of my own learning, and I can have the voice and the authority and the autonomy to engage with this subject matter, then the chances are I'll do something with that. Ask for solutions. Ask for solutions rather than giving solutions. Find out from your people what they need. We're about nearly an hour in, so I think now is probably a good time to think about What questions do you have? What else would you like to ask? And if we need to run over a bit, people can stay. I'm happy to run over a bit. People need to go. Thanks very much for attending. Neil, do you want to manage this side of things?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Will, and thanks for coping it in the moment with the, as someone said, you got to love technology, haven't you? So, as a few people have asked you, so we recorded the whole webinar. So what we'll try and do after today is splice the audio back with the visuals and send you a recording. If we can't do that, then we'll send you both. So you'll have the recording. We've recorded that anyway for the audio, and we have the slide deck. But hopefully we'll be able to splice the two together afterwards. But either way, you'll have both. I just sort of finish then, Will, on a couple of questions. Then, if we say we're conscious we're pushing up to an hour now, but I guess a few people along a similar theme have raised something along the lines of so that everyone gets this in organisations generally when it's raised at an intellectual level and understands what it means and all the things you've been talking about today, but then struggle with how they actually enact it and engage with it practically within the organisation. I mean, is that what's your experience of that with the organisations you've worked with?
Yeah. So yeah, practically, what do you do? That's the $64,000 question. So we like the idea of this. We think there's something around our organisation that would benefit from exploring this. What do we do? The real answer is I've yet to come across two organisations that experience bias in the same way. Given that organisations themselves are often wildly different, big, small, different areas of focus, different areas of the country, different demographics, etc. Because it's so personal, the work that I do with people is always extremely personal. I think some topics tend to get more airtime, and that's when I think organisations want to prescribe a problem in order that they can prescribe a solution. So I'm working with some organisations at the moment focused on gender bias. So how do we help people progress in an organisation where women historically have got to a certain level but no further? And whilst that is useful as a starting point, what it can sometimes do is then mean that we're going to spend loads of time working on women because obviously they're the ones who need all the extra work because they're the ones not progressing. And my suggestion is often to think about working with the organisation as a whole or working with a particular area of the organisation as a whole, men, women, both, because it is part of an intrinsic relationship between everybody that's supporting a particular bias, be it gender bias or be it bias against people of particular educational background or race or preference or sexuality or whatever it is. So in terms of what one actually does, I spend time working with organizations, firstly finding out with them what it is they experience, and unless you're prepared to do the investigation, and sometimes that's a couple of conversations, sometimes that's half a week, but unless you're prepared as an organization to do some investigation in terms of, so what do we like, what do we do, why do we do this, then it's very hard to actually come up with a meaningful solution. And looking for an off-the-shelf program, an off-the-shelf psychometric that labels people or labels organizations with the problem and then meters out a particular solution tends not to have a particularly big impact. And it may in the moment have an impact, but in terms of any sustainability, it makes no difference at all, because bias is there as part of a cultural element of why that business exists in the first place, and everybody is condoning the biases because it still exists. So if you're not clear as to why those things exist in the first place, and then it's very difficult to find that solution. So practically, again, back to the question, what do? You speak to people in the organization at all levels. You work out where the change needs to happen and what specifically is going to work with those people. Sometimes it's skill-based, sometimes it's attitude, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's a systemic thing, so you want to work on how teams work together. Sometimes there's literally not enough people to talk to in the organization to voice concerns. So those are some of the practical things, and I think anybody who's listening from an LN background will know that there's endless workshops that you can do on specific elements, but putting that together in a context of unconscious bias, I think is something that needs to be done with precision and with a degree of intimacy that is relevant to that particular organization.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Will. I'm conscious of the time, but I'm noticing that a lot of people are still with us. So if we go for one last quick question, because there seems to be a theme on this from a few people. And therefore a quick answer if we can, Will. No pressure. Is around So if we want to engage with this, how it seems like a really complex issue at all these different levels in an organisation. If you're going to engage with it at a practical level, how quickly can you see the impact and results and outcomes and changes happen at a behavioural level at an organisational level?
Very quickly, I would suggest, and I would suggest that there is also a positive and negative that. Positive and negative. It's very quickly on the negative side. When a company identifies, or it's identified from some perspective in the organisation, leadership, H&D, HR, whatever it is, talent. When they identify a problem, that then is they then push out to everybody else and say, these are the problem things, and this is the solution. The impact is immediate, which is, oh, we knew they'd say that. Oh, why isn't the board involved with it? Oh, well, it's nothing to do with me. So the immediate impact can be extremely negative if it's not something that benefits everybody in the organisation. When it's positive and immediate is when everybody is included. And I know it sounds really broad, but it is rarer than it is familiar, if you like, for everybody in the organisation to be part of that discussion. I worked with an organisation last year for 6 months on helping unconscious bias and respect to be redefined in the organisation and relived in the organisation. Had great impact. People loved it, and it really, really worked, and it made a big difference. When it got to the board simply said, we're not going to be involved in it. And the message that those 8 people on the board sent out to the rest of the organisation had as much of an impact as the previous 6 months of work that we did. Yeah. And clearly it's not we're interested, it's everybody else is the problem, go do.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it can be immediate. And if you get into this subject and you start working on this as a form of development with your people, what you start with and the immediate message you send out and the immediate work that you do with people is going to be critical in terms of the input, because that will be the environmental and the condition changes that is going to impact on how do we now as an organisation, as a culture, choose to engage with this.
Brilliant. Thanks, Will. I can see we're over time now, so I think we're going to need to call this to an end. So thanks to all of you who joined us today. I hope you found that of interest, and if you want to continue the conversation with us, and we will, then please do get back in touch afterwards. When we close the event now, if you leave your browsers open, there's a feedback form for us. We'd really love to hear your thoughts about the webinar, obviously mainly the content and not the technical issues, because we will try and sort that out afterwards. And as I said, we've got a recording of the whole thing, so we'll share that with you. And hopefully we'll be able to splice that back together with the visuals, so you'll have the full experience afterwards. So thanks for joining us, and Will, thanks again for all your content today. It was really interesting. I'm sure that's raised a lot of thoughts and areas of reflection for people back in their organisation. So thanks very much.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Have a good day, everyone. Thanks. Bye.